Hey guys, sorry I haven't posted in a while. I have been reading some fanfics and I really enjoyed this one. So if you want another episode, please like and subscribe and tell me in the comments below. My audio got destroyed in my moving, so that's why I haven't been recording. Please enjoy. Thank you.
I do not own or profit from any character or place in this story and accept that they are the property of the original creators. Chapter 1: Who Said a Fox Isn't Cunning? A thick fog blanketed the moss-covered ground, surviving defiantly in the face of its sunlight nemesis in the sky, but what one could truly notice about this fog was that it was more magical in nature than was natural, as it didn't seem to spread out, nor was it lifting under the midday sun. Instead, it seemed to just dance around the area it was in, as if content with its current surroundings and had no intention of leaving. Silent as it slowly creeped along the plush surface of the ground and brushed against the damp moss that seemed to sparkle in the dew that survived and was twinkling in what little of the sun's rays were allowed to penetrate the dew's protector, only hindered by the white fabric that would interrupt its mindless nature. The bright, near-blinding light that it gained from reflecting the sun's attempt to dissipate it only darkening in a spot where a shadowy silhouette of the bring draped in a near-white robe that stood lazily in the fog, staring out of it to a great hill, or was it a mountain in the far distance, upon which sat a great city, sat comfortable as and perfectly as if it was the location that grew up around the city and not the other way around. Towers and spires could be seen lifting into the air with shining spike of the many building looking like spears raising up to greet the new day sun. Its opulence and grandeur apparent even from this distance, standing out amongst the low-lying tilled land around it, as if demanding that the world look at it and try to deny its right as one of the greatest cities in the No continent. The being itself was something that at first glance would have had even the most powerful of wizards feel fear in their hearts, with lesser ones running in fear from its presence, as if you were to stand near it you could feel the great amount of anger and hatred roll off its form like agitated waves crashing against a lonely shore, creating a more suffocating atmosphere than the very fog that surrounded it. Its eyes gave off a blazing red near orange glow, more in the shade of an angry sunrise than a blood-like color most would believe it should match, and so intense its focus was on the city in the distance that if possible it would be rendered to would combust under the pressure. Draped over its shoulder and held in a fine silk band was thick lush red hair winding down to the calmly rising chest of the being to whom it belonged to. Its face, a terrifying beauty as the sun mixed with the being's presence, only enhanced its already vivid details and gave it an almost godlike appearance, with not a single blemish or feature out of place, with its thin ruby lips under a sharp nose that led to a slightly pointed chin, all on a near pale white celestial skin that basked in the sun's rays. The white kimono that hugged its form was decorated with red swirls and flowers that could be identified as fire lilies, wrapping around slender but well-maintained and perfected body, opening at the top slightly to allow for a slight peek at a chest area that would make most females jealous and halt most men in their tracks. The now identified female being had one more trait that would make it impossible to identify it as a human event in its current form, and that was its 9 large, proudly displayed and well-groomed tails that flowed out from behind its form, each one easily the length of the female's body and tipped with white fur. They were fanned out behind her, swaying gently in the light breeze while being held up to give her form an almost peacock-like appearance by this very act, as the very thought of one of her most prized and beloved features even having the chance of touching the ground would send waves of disgust and denial though her not only her mind but her very being as well. In her a deceivingly delicate hand she clutched protectively a glass cube that contained a gold haze with a dense center that was moving lazily around its confines as if not worried for its current predicament. Her powerful claws retracted to make sure it didn't damage the container, even if she knew it would take a far greater power to even scratch the glass, let alone break it. Her other hand rested on the hilt of a katana, the blade of which sprung out from the maw of a fox-shaped head handle which had 9 red tassels on its base and red gems for its eyes. The blade itself had an array of strange symbols that were arrayed across its razor-sharp edge, and on the flat side an image of a great 9-tailed fox running across the length of the blade, whose tails made it look like it had sprung out of the maw of the fog-headed handle. Kuaki stood on the soft ground, staring in the distance at the city, inspecting its inhabitants both physical and magically, as if staring at an insect and determining if it was worth the effort to stand on or not. For while no normal or even magical creature, be they human, elf, demon or even devil to some extent, could ever hope to see anything for where she was standing, Kueki was decidedly and proudly not in that category, as indicated by not only her ethereal appearance she gave off but also in her ability to not only see the city with near perfect accuracy at such a distance but also feel nearly all the energy around her, both magical as well as emotional. Such an ability was starting to create some doubt in her mind as to the plan she had originally formed, and was leading her opinion to form a new plan, one less likely to cause larger problem and more complication for her goals down the line. The suffering she felt, along with the surprising amount of indifference that these humans showed to others of their own race based solely on riches and station, was enough to make her want to snuff out life in the land she stood in. But she knew she couldn't go through with that thought, as she had learned long ago that when threatened, even with other options, humans fought with a great amount of tenacity and surprising power, being able to pull some of the most surprising results and techniques out of only the gods know where to protect themselves, even if it at the unwanted side effect of allowing the part of their species they detested survive as well. No, if change was to happen, it needed to be like a slow-moving medicine, introduced to the body in slow and incremental amounts so as to ever so slowly but effectively mend the rifts and division in humanity, while never alerting the ever-skeptical race to just how much change was happening and where it was originating from. That being said, the power levels that these humans showed were in some ways quite varying, with the power levels of humans in the city on the hill much greater than many of the humans in the lower laying land. This being due to the so-called royalty and nobility having far greater reserves of power in general than those outside of it, evidently from breeding with each other and the once-in-a-while injection of new untainted energy into the blood pool by those who showed potential of benefiting the upper echelons of the society. But in the long run, Kueki knew that power could only amount to so much and was only one part of the formula that made up the ultimate goal of nearly all beings, which was greatness, as brains along with the willingness to go beyond one's potential and the bonds one forms with others were also needed in order to dive one to the ultimate goal. For one cannot truly be great without the will to do so, the knowledge to make it so, the power to get them there, and the bonds to acknowledge and fuel the drive to achieve better. These traits not only needed to be present in the being but also needed to be nurtured, as there was no hope in one being able to make it to greatness without an abundance of all four. It essential needs to be the perfect blend of what happened when nature and nurture combine and work together. And from what she can feel from where she stood, there were very little humans that possessed even half of these traits, let alone all four in the quantities needed to achieve what truly mattered. She knew that if her plan was to succeed, then all these traits must be ingrained in her charge and then cultivated, and that once completed, the finished result would not only be a land but also a being that could not only stand the test of time and all its consequences but also shine brighter than ever before and be a beacon for others to aspire to, for them to take up the light and keep it going and make a better world than they arrived in, all the while giving her charge the recognition and praise they deserved. Closing her eyes for a brief second, she could still remember what had driven her down this path to this plan, for better or for worst. Flashback. She could feel her prison shaking and see the lights darkening. Here is the once calm water that lay at base of her prison bar surge forward and backwards as if in the presence of a hurricane, violently roaring as it smashed against the bars, and taste the pain and anguish in the air around her. The cause of this great calamity in her mind was multiple factors, one of them being her very emotions at the time, which were a mixture of both fear and a great anger. Fear of what happens after the lights finally went out and her prison and world becomes black, anger at the foolish and disgusting insects that were the main cause of this calamity, but maybe insects was the wrong label to use on them. Yes, monsters was probably a better term, for what else could you use to describe a mob of humans that would hunt one of their own young down and burn them alive? And all the while during this great atrocity they were singing and dancing around the fire, while some would be throwing more fuel on it. Her disgust and anger growing even larger when she noticed that among their numbers were those sworn to protect the peace and those in need, shinobi laughing and chatting away as if it was a barbecue and all they were doing was having some drinks while their food cooked, as if in reality it was not a small child who was slowly being cooked alive. Never before had she felt such anger and hatred for humans, not even when under the control of that damned pink-eye freak or first sealed away by the tree-happy weirdo. Never before has she felt such shame at her powerlessness to help the one true innocent party in all this, but also anger at herself for adding to their suffering by intentionally sending her host nightmares and depriving them of sleep in some sick way of getting revenge for the years of imprisonment she had to go through and the years yet left to complete. No, the true despair and anger came at the unintended effects that her warden had for holding her and what it was causing now. To most, the benefit of increased healing and strong body that came with being a part of an illustrious bloodline like the Uzumakis, with the effects being further increased due to the regenerative abilities of her Charka and powers, would be a godsend and would in truth make someone very hard to kill, but in this case it was the greatest of curses, for as the child burnt he regenerated his burnt skin, and any lost blood would be also be recreated, muscles would heal and eyes would regrow after being melted, only to burn all over again as the fire he was in was kept going. So long as she had Charka and the seal kept working and sapping it away, her host would undergo the most twisted version of a phoenix rebirth ever. She could feel the pain and the hopelessness of her warden, feel how a light that had once resisted all other darknesses was now starting to dim from the onslaught of pain mixed with hopelessness and despair, and how the soul was slowly starting to go insane from all the strain that it was being put under. She wanted nothing more now than for the child to die and to no longer have to wither away in front of her from its traumatizing experiences, and would even consider letting these tormentors have a quick death if they provided it, but she knew that would never happen as the hatred of these monsters was too great. And their sick intent too driven to even generate that idea, let alone play with it. See what you have wrought, Yandaime Hokage. You have successfully saved this cesspool of inhumanity and murdered the light. I hope you suffer for eternity in the death god's stomach, for even then it would not be enough to match the pain your son feels now, raged Kuiki internally as she started to slam herself against the gates of the prison, hoping against hope that something would happen, but like usual her request went unanswered. Soon the inevitable happened, as it always does to those who can no longer stand the hatred that they feel, and a great sorrow took its place with pain as its ever-familiar companion. Hearing the screams of the victim and the laughs of the victors made her start to question her own purpose for the first time in a millennia. What is the point in having great power if I'm unable to use it? I was charged with preventing the dark side, this dark side of humanity, from taking over, but I became so immersed in their dark energies that I gave into my own hate. Madara's nature drove me even further, and the enslavement of my siblings drove me off the proverbial cliff, and now because I failed to prevent myself from falling to such a weak emotion, a child is being tortured in front of me. Is this my punishment? Am I to stand vigil, trough out this, and lose what little compassion and sanity I have left for failing in my first duty and promise? As she was being devoured by these thoughts, she stared on and opened her senses to what was happening, as if to add fuel to the already painful emotions she was experiencing, wanting to experience and understand in some way the suffering he felt. They say it is only when the dark is at its greatest do you start to notice even the tiniest bits of light, and while she lay there experiencing the world as it was around her, the light shone like a burning sun to her, and it finally gave way to an idea on how to stop all this in some twisted form of a solution. She started to act on her thoughts immediately, as any time spent on thinking more on it was impossible in the current conditions, and she wouldn't let her now decided on charge suffer one more second if possible. For in the end all beings must pay a debt, and she would be the willing collector and investor in that debt for the first time. Death is a peculiar phenomenon, its universal and inevitability striking fear into the very core of any sensible being, as one can never know the end of a story until one gets to it, and once they are there the rest of the story becomes meaningless, so the mystery of what comes after death has always been a closely guarded secret by those who understood it, and the nature of death was an even greater guarded secret. Kuiki was a being that had lived for a very long time, and during that time she had learned more knowledge than any entity alive on the elemental nation, even more than her father, and one of the things she learned or invested in learning about, because she dealt it out so often and usually violently in her adolescence, was death in all of the forms it came in, and right now she could feel the death energy fluctuating around her. One moment it was there when her warden was just about to embrace it, and the next it was gone as her warden was healed. When he was near death again, the energy of death would appear once more, only to vanish as he was healed again, and so the brutal dance went on. But as the death energy was being summoned and dissipated, a new phenomenon occurred. When a cracked or broken bone is healed, there is always some form of a scar or mark left behind to mark the injury, and over time, if the same thing keeps happening, those leftover marks increase in size and severity, and the once stable bone that was healed so many times is now beyond saving. The same principle can be assigned to death energy and what happens when a being is near death but escapes it, and this is what was happening to her warden, and should this horrible cycle continue on for another couple of 100 times, he would eventually die, as the death energy left behind would be greater than his life force even after healing, and would override it and lead to the snuffing out of the holder's life. Now she had no time, not the inclination, to wait that amount of time and let both her warden and herself experience the hundreds of deaths it would take to get there, but thanks to the secondary actions of the foolish Yandaime during the sealing, she didn't have to. For when he sealed himself in the stomach of the death god along and took with him her yin charka, he essentially created a link between her charka in the realm of death and her charka in the realm of the living. Charka is charka and linked together no matter if it's yin or yang, as it will always search out to find its dance partner and try to reconnect with it, and as it was a form or energy and not complete, it couldn't be destroyed nor could it be converted to death energy as it usually is when a being with charka dies. And in the split moments that the death energy was at its height in her container, she could feel her yin charka in the death realm reach out to reunite with its yang half. If not for the seal that prevented her charka from leaving until the bearer died, then her yang would meet up with her yin in the death realm and she would in essence die, as death had a far tighter drip on her yin charka than she had on her yang in the realm of the living. But because the seal was there and blessed by the death god himself, it was like an immovable anchor in the realm of the living that she was essentially tied to. By using this anchor she could reach out every time she felt their yin charka and drag it back to her. Now while normally this would increase her reserves and complete her, it also had a very frightening if not somewhat amusing side benefit. For while she dragged the yin charka to her, she was also able to increase the flow of the death energy as well, as by forcing her charka back to her it was essentially also bringing what death charka was attached to it to the host body as well, increasing the flow of death energy by a tremendous amount. By her estimate, it would mean that within the next 10 cycles or so there would be enough energy to eventually let her warden die and not suffer further. Now while this was one goal, there was another more powerful goal, due to the increased flow of death energy in the her yin charka coming directly from the death god himself, as it was technically in his stomach. It would mean that the chance of the death god not noticing the change was near non-existent, and when he did notice, it would lead to him investigating, as stealing from a god in any way was dangerous, and stealing from a death god was to spit in the fact of death itself and therefore would lead him to her, and that is where the real plan would begin. They say gods don't care for anyone or anything unless it impacts them directly, and for once Kuoki was proud to say that was correct in all sense of the word. It was no more than 2 cycles later that the mindscape of her warden darkened and the rate of death energy flowing out of the body stopped. The lights that were still dimming went out and the fur on her went to high alert as a dark and menacing being appearing in front of Kuoki. Purple in color with great horns coming from its head and with a white kimono robe enveloping its body, and in one hand it held prayer beads while in the other it held a ritual knife. Its eyes were dark and brimming with restrained power, were glowering down at the perceived thief that would dare steal something belonging to death itself. For the first time in an age, the Kyuubi no Kitsune bowed its head and body in reverence and penance for what it had done, as it wouldn't do to anger to very thing you want to make a deal with. My lord, I apologize for stealing from you that which is not mine to claim anymore, but I must speak with you and wish to make a deal, said Kuoki in a solemn tone. The eyes of the Shinigami narrowed as if judging if what she had to say was worth the wait and just killing her for her insolence. When it made no movement or gesture, Kuoki took it as an indication to proceed with her plea. My lord, as you know, I am sealed within the body of Naruto Uzumaki, paying for the crime of attaching the Leaf Village after I was released from his mother and controlled. If you cast out your senses to the outside world of this body, you can see that that host is being denied death, and by doing so the people of the Leaf are mocking you. She stops talking to allow the Shinigami to see what is happening outside and to collect her thoughts. The eyes of the death god flit to look over her shoulder and stare into the distance as if looking to a far-out place. The only indication that something was agitating, if not angering, the death god was the sound of the prayer beads grinding and groaning against each other, as well as the squeak of the knife handle as the being hands tightened ever so slightly. If this was done so in the name of the death it was being prevented from claiming, or in the manner in which it was being done so was not said nor displayed, but as the knife had yet to descend upon Kuoki, she continued quickly, as she also felt the death energy in the mindscape get heaver and move more irredicably. I wish to make a deal with you, claim the soul of one Uzumaki Naruto when he is on the cusp of death next, as I know you are within you right to do, and you can have my soul and energy in its entirety when I die, instead of it dissipating and reforming, which is what is usually happening now. On top of that, let me have vengeance for my host on this blaspheming village before you claim me. This I ask as a favor, stated Kuoki as she looked in the eyes of the Shinigami with resolve, as any sign of weakness would be rooted out if she didn't. For if this worked out, then Naruto would get both peace and vengeance for his death, and she might be able to regain some of her lost honor. The Shinigami looked at her and then opened its mouth for the first time. Fate's destiny, prophesy, I can't claim, came the short but raspy response from the death god. Fate's destiny, prophesy, what does that mean? Thought Kuoki in frustration, as she tried to make sense of what the death god meant by that. Is Naruto part of some king of prophesy? If so, then his destiny is already laid out, and if that is the case, then he is protected by the fates, so not even death can claim him until he has complete the prophesy. Fucking prophesy. Why do I feel like this is the Toad's fault all over again? Thought Kueki, in even more frustration as she tried to think of a way to bypass this. Death universal, destiny universal, fates universal, came a raspy sound from the death god. Does that mean what I think it does? Why is he saying this? Thought Kueki in both hope and in suspicion as a new and much more beneficial plan formed in her mind. Maybe she wouldn't kill the Toads if this worked out. Who was she kidding? She detests Toads after being sat on by one. Okay, new deal then. Let me find a body to reincarnate Naruto's soul in. If death, fate and destiny are universal, then no matter what world he is reborn in, he can still complete what has been laid out for him, and you will eventually get to claim his soul that should be worth a lot more than it is in its current state. If not, then we can wait the 2 or so hours for him to die for real, unless those other two intervene somehow to protect Naruto, and if they don't, then this was destined to happen. No. Kueki responded again in hope as it lit in her eyes for the first time in a while. Yes, she would still die, but Naruto would get a change to live in a better life than he did here. The Shinigami's mouth twitched the smallest amount as if he was pleased for some reason and stretched his arms out while grasping his fingers tight around the objects in them. Both started flowing as the death energy in the air increased exponentially. All of a sudden the bars to the cell started cracking and the seal started failing. Two light could be seen traveling from the seal into the Shinigami's beads, and when finally the dark energy was at its peak, the Shinigami swung his blade, cutting right through it, all the while swinging the beads over the now severed energy as it absorbed some form of dark golden energy that looked to be starting to fray. Kueki started to fade in the mindscape as it got darker and lost all concept of space and substance, and the Shinigami vanished, still wearing a small twisted smile while holding the new energy. The last thing one could see in the dark was a large set of white fangs curled in a smile that promised fire and blood in abundance to come. Konoha Forest. The mood in the clearing was one of jubilation for the simple reason of that the greatest insult to the people of Konoha was finally getting what it deserved, and they all had a front seat to its execution. The fact the demon couldn't die due to its regenerative powers was a great unexpected plus, and they made sure to make use of it. The fire had been going for about 5 hours now, and the screaming of the demon was like constant sweet music to their ears and made them all forget about what they had lost to it years ago. Some had lost sons, other daughters or father and mothers, some husband and wives or brother and sisters. Now all were getting their justly earned vengeance. It did not matter if the demon was sealed in the body of a child, as the child was already corrupted by the demon the second it was in there, and it needed to be destroyed. Who cared about an orphan brat anyway? And this did seemed like the best way it could have happened. The child's body acted as the prison to the demon and let them hear through its screams what the demon was feeling. On top of that, they were doing their civic duty by banishing a demon from a possessed child. Maybe they could petition to get an reward from the fire temple. After all, they were doing their job for them. Some thought. No, though, was given to the child's suffering, and if it was unfair to him or if they should just make it quick, as mercy was not what this was about. Baruka, we finally did it. We finally avenged our families and the demon is suffering, said a silver-haired man to a brown-haired individual that was sitting beside him drinking some sake. I know. Did you know if we didn't do this, I would have had to teach it next year how to be a shinobi? Can you imagine that? Stated the now identified Aruka, horrified at the idea. Well, thank the gods for Kakashi then and his ability to lure away its protection and trap the monster. Anyway, I need to go to relieve myself. Be back shortly, stated the silver-haired Chunin as he walked towards the fire that was burning with the silhouette of a child in it and proceeded to urinate into the fire, paying particular attention to where he was aiming. To the side of the clearing, tied to a tree, screaming and weeping, were a man and his daughter. The ramen chef and his daughter were caught trying to protect the monster, so now they had front row seat to see what should happen to demons, or so they were told. Oi, stop screaming or you will get far worse than just being tied up. You're demon's lovers and should be hoping to be purged of its influence once it's dead. If you keep screaming and making a noise, you will ruin this lovely night. We might need to discipline you even more, but don't worry, we won't touch you, old man. I think we can discipline both for you through you, daughter, shouted one of the men in the clearing while giving the girl tied to the tree a lecherous stare, which was being copied by some others once they heard the shouting. The chef's eyes blazed like an unholy fire, but then dimmed just as quickly as he realized how hopeless the situation was, and he hung his head and stayed quiet, motioning for his daughter to do the same, avoiding the reproachful stare he got in response, but nonetheless she followed suit. Suddenly the screams of agony originating from the fire stopped and was replaced with a deafening silence. Has the demon dies? It seems so finally used all its demonic powers in regenerating. What now? I say we piss on the ashes and then scatter them to the winds. I. While this twisted discussion about what to do with the child's remains was happening, no one noticed that the color of the flames had changed color from an orange to a deep blood red. They did, however, notice when they were blown off their feet into the air by a powerful charca blast. Once he had orientated himself after being sent flying, Iruka turned in the direction of the fire, his heart stopping and eyes widening. His tanned skin, which was the envy of many and had gotten him into a few beds, had turned white as he was unable to comprehend what was in front of him. How has this happened? This wasn't supposed to happen. It was a demon-possessed child. It was supposed to burn with the brat. Not this. What have we done? Thought Iruka in pure dread as he looked up at the tall red fir-like blind pillars in front of him and had his eyes travel up them like gazing up a sick and blooded tree. Going up from the leg all the way to a top was a head that looked like a fox with large bunny-style ears, and then down the sleek trimmed body of the fox all the way to 9 flowing tails that waved behind it, knocking over and destroying much of the forest that was in its vicinity. He followed the fox's hand as it lifted itself up along with its tails, watched as it was ignited in a red fire that spread throughout its body and whose heat could be felt even from where he was standing, and then with a single motion that sounded like a hurricane winds came down so fast that he couldn't blink as he would miss it. He wished he had blinked. When the tails and the hand landed, it first sent a shock wave through the earth that could be felt from his toes to his skull. It reverberated around the body for a bit before traveling back down and before re-entering the ground all in a split second. The shockwave traveled on through the forest and to the tall walls of the city and beyond. Then came the real carnage as the earth was ripped up out of the ground like a hand had come from the sky and plucked it up and was tossing it about. Those close to the impact zone, like the ramen chef and his daughter, died instantly with no pain. Those who were outside it tried to run or avoid being crushed by falling boulders that came crashing back down to earth. Not that it mattered much, as when the shock wave in the earth hit them, they were once again blown off their feet, only this time with the earth following them and landing on them. Iruka could only stare in horror as his friends and other who had come to what was supposed to be a celebration were crushed to death until he noticed a shadow overtake his. Looking up, he saw a new set of boulders coming towards him and knew he could not outrun or dodge them. "I'm coming to you finally, my beloved family," were his final thought as he was crushed under 20 tons of earth, his last sight being the angry visage of a giant fox with a dark horned figure looming behind it, a sick and twisted smile on its face, like it had achieved a victory that it had previously been denied. The same look was copied on the fox's face, but was mixed with a rage that set even the air around it on fire, it seemed. Once it had finished with the pests in the clearing, the Kyuubi turned its attention to the village, its hate for it prevalent in its red eyes as its wide gaping maw opened up and small balls of red and blue charca gather in front of it. In the villager, screams could be heard as people started to realize the danger they were in and heard the siren's sound used to alert people to evacuate the village. She saw as its shinobi forces ran towards her as if in some vain attempt it would help. Humans might be ingenious and stubborn, but they were not gods, and this time it was she who had one on her side. But it was too late, and unlike last time, things were very different. She wasn't being controlled, so her attention and concentration was not in trying to regain control of her body. She didn't have a giant toad or a seal master to deal with or chains to contain her. Her anger wasn't split between too many people, it was now solely focused on the accursed village in front of her, and she came here not as a mindless controlled beast but as a being with great power in its possession and a plan on how to make its anger known. There was nothing and no one to stop her, and she knew it and reveled in the thought. Vengeance is swift, and a scorned woman's vengeance is even swifter, and she was a scorned female with near infinite charca, and a lot of vengeance pointed at no only at the village but at the world that failed to meet her father's expectations and imprisoned and tortured her siblings, for no matter how much they annoyed her with their own weakness, they were still hers, and she would have her vengeance in their name. An arm made of red fire came out of her torso, and with a swath that sent out a great shockwave of air that ripped trees out of the ground, that sent all the incoming shinobi flying back, with many of them impacted the great walls that now had a new purpose, that being that instead of acting as a defense against attacks, acted as a cage to the people inside, and those that hit it died on impact. There was no Yondaime to teleport away the get-tailed beast ball that went traveling from the Kyuubi's mouth to the Hokage monument faster than most people could track, no Uchiha or Senju to contain the blast that ripped through the mountain face, wiping out the 4 faces that adorned, as well as also killing anyone that was lucky enough to make it to the shelters, as in now became their tomb. The return blast traveled over the village, stopping only halfway to the wall, leaving anything within the blast zone little more than ash. On the outside of the blast zone, those lucky enough to get inside shelters would be probably survive, while those not in shelters would be luck to survive the backlash. The Kyuubi then turned its head towards the sky and once again gathered charka in its mouth once more, but this time it was far greater than before. It poured nearly all its remaining charka into it, making the tailed beast ball the size of a mountain. It then swallowed it and proceeded to shoot it out of its mouth at a speed then boggled the mind in the direct of the thing that would be the key to its vengeance. I'm sorry, Father, but this world is no longer the world you defended and died for. It no longer deserves to survive, and the one that could have carried your will can no longer do so here. I will purge this world of life and hopefully it will start anew, thought Kueki as she watched her greatest attack impact upon the moon, breaking off a large chunk of it that came hurtling towards the elemental nations. Knowing that this would kill thousands if not millions filled her with sadness, but it was pale compared to her rage at the state of the world. Her siblings and their hosts would survive, and who know, maybe they would prevent some of the damage getting the recognition they deserved, but in the end it was up to them if they wanted to save as much humans as they could. She had already cast her vote, she concluded, as the part of the moon that was coming to the earth started to glow red and she started to fade once more. Maybe the afterlife won't be that bad. I can get some sleep without having to worry for once, and I can see Father again, she thought contentedly as the last of her presence on the planet faded away, never to be seen or felt again. End of flashback. And I was so looking forward to some sleep, she wistfully lamented as she started to glow a bright red color, the shape of the glowing form changing, losing the 9 tails that dragged behind. When the glowing stopped, in its place was a tall woman with the look of nobility, with blood-red hair, with porcelain skin, wearing the same kimono as she was before, the katana now strapped to her back. Gone was the suffocating presence, and in its place a calm and indifference, one that gave of a vibe of uncaring and unapproachable, just as she had intended, as she had not interest in spending or talking to a race that had let her down so much, even it was a new land. Ah well, later, after this is all done, I can get some more beauty sleep, as this whole ordeal has left me a bit frazzled, she smiled as she started to make her way to the city on a hill. She looked down at her hands at the glass container that contained the soul of one Naruto Uzumaki, a lot brighter in color than when it was removed from his body, and more wholesome as well, which greatly pleased her, as remember what she was told to do before she arrived in this land. Find a body, preferably a child or baby's, place the soul in it, and then a bit of my essence if possible, and once done I shall fade away, reminding herself what needed to be done. She was going to give Naruto a new life, and more importantly she got to choose what type of life he was going to have. For the first time ever, her maternal side came forth, making it clear that nothing but the best home and future would be acceptable for Naruto, and she doesn't have the room to fail in this self-appointed duty. It was very convenient that the Shinigami, under the pressure of the fates, and because it would mean the Naruto's soul wouldn't be tainted by her energy, was reverted to when it was purer than when it had been when he had died in that world. She was told that the memories and the true personality of the new reincarnated body would absorb the soul of Naruto as well as his memories and personality too, but they would be sealed away to prevent half to the body's native soul, and would slowly leak into the new body so it could adapt better. When she asked what would happen with his memories of that night, she was informed that his soul was retrieved the day before it happened, as if taken that night the damage done to it would not make it possible to reincarnate, so it would have no recollection of that night nor have experienced the same emotion as it had previously. She nearly kissed the Shinigami after this statement, best not think of that. As she started to walk towards the targeted city, she walked through a village that had a very interesting feature, that being a ginormous skull of a demon with many horns. From what she had seen on a sign for directions, the village was called Hage, and was a small farming village with some farms and a church and a near-perfect view of the far-off city that it was in the shadow of. She saw fields upon fields with rows upon rows of underground crops being grown, looking ready to burst from the ground already. The sun and the need to harvest the grown crops seemed to have caused all the residents to come out and partake in the harvest, as evident by the amount of people using magic to clear the fields, from the men picking out the crops to the children cleaning and ripping of any leaves, while leaving a more of a mess than they clean, as was usually in their nature. Off to one side of the village was a church, gray with stone structure and bland in design, with a single black-haired priest standing outside shaking hands with people, and when noticing her offering her a polite nod as she walked by, her returning it, resulting in the attention that she was already receiving to increase as the men watching her fell instantly under her gaze and smile. Deciding it was for the best to leave the village as quickly as possible, as she had already drawn too much attention, she sped up her pace. No, she couldn't just vanish, as it would bring even more unwanted investigations. As she was passing the giant skull, she felt some energy that was both wholesome but also full of dread at the same time. Looking at the demon skull, she could see that on top of it was a statue of some boy or small man that for some reason was emanating some of the weird wholesome energy, along with more energy coming from the inside the skull as well that was a lot more sinister in nature. But as much as she wanted to investigate the phenomenon and find out what could give off such a vibe and challenge it, as she was always up for a good fight, it was not the goal of this journey, and for her, bringing Naruto back to life and making him happy was far more important than sating her battle lust. As she left the village, she gave pause and gave a quick squinted look one last time to the giant skull and smirked, thinking, I could total take that on, as she one more made her way down the road with a slight hop in her step. Arriving in the giant city took a bit longer than she had hoped for, partly due to she didn't move as fast as she could, as she didn't want to risk any form of danger or damage to the soul container, which would ruin and possibly start her on a rampage in frustration. The city was much larger than any in the elemental nations, and quite frankly put what city the nations did have to shame, with stone buildings that shined, the warmer and a much brighter atmosphere, and the fact it looked more sophisticated than the nations made for a much better improvement over Konoha, even with its social class issues. As she waked, she could see people once again using magic everywhere to do simple to complex tasks like heating food to building a new store to even in one case creating a small cloud over flowers to protect them from the sun or provide some rain, as well as flying on brooms. And was that a magic carpet? Much more versatile than Charka, it seems, were the curious and giddy thoughts going through her head as she imagined all the cool things Naruto would do with magic. Though why they need those glowing books to do it was still confusing, as from what she can feel the magical energy was in the person, not the book, so surely they could just do stuff without a book. Maybe because they lacked a proper magical network in the body like Charka did, they needed the books to help channel the energy in different forms. As she passed on by a couple using some form of wind magic to levitate a new couch down the street, she put the thought to the side and decided to think on it later. She was hungry and still had a lot of work to do. Once again, her thoughts of food and rest were overruled by the necessity of the mission bestowed upon her, and she started to look for someone or someplace where Naruto could be reincarnated, or at least get some information to where was best to start, as none of the people around her matched the energy requirements needed to hold a second soul before it merged or to match her expectations for Naruto. Even the strangely colored robed humans that had a much higher magical energy than most, mostly lacking, with only one or two barely meeting her entry-level criteria. She decided to spend much of her initial time in the city look for answers in one of the local bars, listening to conversations, as she knew that where alcohol flowed so did loose lips, and loose lips made for free information. She quickly discovered she was in Clover Kingdom, and this was the capital, and that there was several other kingdoms around them, all named after a suit of cards in a deck. Weird, but she had seen and experienced weirder, talking giant toads. The more she listened, the more she learned of the Clover Kingdom she was in, such as there was for some reason two kings, one for the kingdom as a whole and one for the wizards. Or was she getting it right? Sounded a lot like the shinobi system with the daimyo and the cages, meaning the Clover King had more power than the Wizarding King, even though it did seem that the Wizarding King had more respect and was liked more than the Clover King. There were 3 royal families for some reason and not one. How that logic worked she didn't know. Currently the royal house of Kira were the ruling family, with Augustus Kira Clover 13 the current king of the Clover Kingdom, but from what her heard he was a fool with a big head and very little potential, and his arrogance and vanity made his subject dislike him, and there was even whispers of wanting the Wizarding King to be the sole ruler instead. Then there was the Silva family, who were a bunch of stuck in the muds from what she could get, but were able to manipulate their chosen element into shapes for them to fight, and were overall the most level-headed, if not a bit on the arrogant side as well, a trait she felt was shared by any family that had power for too long without a good kick every now and then to bring them back down to reality. They seemed to hold a hereditary seat as captains of a wizarding knight squad and were said to be exceptional fighters. And finally, there was the Vermilion family, which to her sounded a lot like the Uzumaki family, what with their red or orange hair and their love of fights, no back-down attitude, as well as being insanely passionate and somewhat obsessed with vows they made, to the point of it was said that they burnt themselves when they made a vow. Overall, she was more inclined to the Vermilion family for obvious reason, as the attitude was already a key part of Naruto's personality, and like always, red and orange was just too cool of a color to ignore. From what she had heard from people in the bar over the last few days, both the wives of the heads of families were pregnant, so that would make things a lot easier and as well as safer for Naruto when it came to placing the soul in a body. Implanting the soul into a fetus would make the merger a lot easier, as the soul of yet-to-be-born baby would not be fully developed yet with experience or memories, and so would absorb Naruto's soul quicker, as well as the added soul during the development stage would make the overall body and final soul a lot more resilient to taint and corruption. Also, the child would have a more potent and powerful mana source, as not only would it still be developing its mana capacity for years to come even after it's born, but it would also have Naruto's added potential source as well. As all bodily energies, no matter what form it take, is connected to the soul, as energy cannot be created or destroyed, what really happens is the soul starts to harness the energy in the surrounding atmosphere and then absorbs it and converts it into new energy for the bod. The more potent the soul, the faster it absorbs the surrounding energy, and more potent the new converter energy is, and the stronger the body is, the greater its capacity to hold this new form of energy. So by adding Naruto's already potent soul to an already potent soul, as it seems that royals develop some of the most potent souls in this kingdom when it is compared to most of the other humans around, and with some extra internal body modifications from her energy, the resulting body and soul should be very powerful in the years to come. She couldn't wait to see what happens if she was still around to see it. After a few days of playing with the idea, she decided it was time to go and complete the transfer, as holding back would not be good for Naruto's soul at all, as a soul needed a body if it wasn't in the afterlife, or at least it start to go mad, as the world of the living was for the living and a soul was not technically native to that part of the world and needed a body to ground it for, say. As she started to travel along the main street towards the top of the city where the residence of the royals were located, she started to come up with a plan on how to get into the Vermilion residence and implant Naruto's soul into the pregnant female that resided there. It wouldn't be a long or hard process, just needed to be done in safely and not disturbed lest the mother die, and that was unacceptable, as a mother's love was key in developing a child's person, and Naruto wouldn't be without a mother if she could help it. She was passing by a restaurant on her left. It looked to her a bit snobbish, with a lot of those wizarding knights eating in there and some nobles, so it had to be expensive, what with its oak furniture and magical lights and suited up serving staff. Though she did give pause as she passed by a window, only to hear some quiet talking. "I heard the king's wife is deadly ill and might not survive the pregnancy along with the unborn child." "Oh, I didn't hear about the king's wife being pregnant," she thought in shock. Hearing this, she looked around, and spotting a dark alleyway right away opposite from the restraint, she cloaked herself in its darkness and tuned her hearing onto the conversation. Well, this is an interesting development. The two men were in magical knight's robes, one in a red robe, another in a blue and silver robe. Both had their backs turned to her, so couldn't see her, listening to them as they discussed something that was probably very private in an open-air restraint with the window open. "I didn't know she was pregnant. How did you hear?" asked the red-robed figure. "I'm part of the royal guards sometimes, and the servants all gossip near us, believing we are as deaf to them as our emotions says. Anyway, apparently the king has stopped caring and is back to sleeping with two separate women again, all the while leaving the poor queen to endure the illness alone, and will probably not care about the unborn child either," said the silver man without any remorse. "Well, what can you expect from our king? What is she ill with? Surely they have a cure of some kind that can come from the royal medics. Apparently it's a magical curse that sucks up any mana that tries to enter the body, and there is no known way of getting rid of the curse or the illness without magic, as there is no non-magical treatment to it, so both the queen and the unborn prince are going to die." This time a bit of sadness could be heard from the silver-robed male. "What makes you so sure it's a male? Seems more like a female from the attitude and general disposition of the king." "Servant told me," said the wizard. "Dr. Owen ran tests and gave gender to the babe just before she got ill." "Well, that's a shame. We could do with an heir," and the queen kept the king somewhat grounded, if only for a bit, lamented the red-robed figure. Hearing all she needed to hear for now, Kueki began to move on again, but this time with new thoughts and a new plan in her mind. "What can you say? If you want to successes, you need to be like a river and adapt to the best path. I could save the queen. It wouldn't be unheard of for a traveling doctor or medics to try save the like of royalty for a reward, and while I'm at it, can present Naruto's soul as some form of cure, which it is in some way for the unborn prince at least. And if royals have the most potent of souls, then a prince's soul should be the most potent of all. Healing the queen would be easy, as curses are little more than a nuisance to my powers, and it would have the side effect of increasing the overall health of the queen so as to give Naruto a mother for certain, and if the king and queen don't spend time together, then she will spend more time with her son. And from what I heard, she is the sensible one out of the two, so best he picks up his habits from her and not form that kingly idiot. Yes, the prince's body would be the perfect soul to host for Naruto's reincarnation, came the now ecstatic thoughts of Kuuki, all thoughts of the previous Vermilion plan forgotten for this much higher risk plan that also could yield greater result. She nearly floated towards the royal palace now, purposely bring the attention of others to her so they would never forget what she was about to do for them all. But she paid little attention to the other people looking or gazing at her as she was spending all the while coming up with a plan as well as a backstory on how she would be able to lift the curse, and she would lift the curse as no pathetic curse could stop her and her Charka, then she would cure the queen's illness, which is also easy as cake, is again the glory of Charka. All this while she was reincarnating Naruto into a body a lot sooner than expected, but she would still be happy that he could finally have a life without prejudice or hate and one day be the leader she now knew he should have been given a chance to be in his last life, because watch out world, as Uzumaki is here and they excel at messing up other people's dreams.